They thought they'd neutralized her. 4 men to take her down, 2 more to strip her of every weapon she carried. By the time they shoved her into the dim, oil-stained cage in the back of the warehouse, they were already laughing, certain she was just another asset gone cold. Excellent cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lena Vex sat on the metal chair they'd bolted to the floor, wrists bound with zip ties that cut into her skin. The smell of rust and salt water clung to the air, the distant sound of waves muffled by corrugated walls. Somewhere outside, a generator chugged in a slow, uneven rhythm. Her captors didn't know who she really was. Or maybe they thought they did. They'd read a dossier, maybe seen a grainy photo from a burned-out file, but paper records never captured the part that mattered, the way she could read a room in seconds, calculate every angle, and turn nothing into a weapon. The leader was a thick-necked man with a crooked nose, his arms crisscrossed with faded prison tattoos. He leaned against the cage, smirking. No guns, no knives, no tricks now. You're done. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lena tilted her head, studying him with the detached calm of someone inspecting a blueprint. 45 seconds, she said softly. He frowned. What? That's how long it'll take, she replied, for me to walk out of here, and for you to stop breathing. The men around him laughed, the sound echoing off the metal walls, but Lena wasn't joking. Every movement of her eyes was deliberate, mapping exits, noting the distance between her and each man, calculating the timing of every strike she'd need to make. The first mistake they made was underestimating her. The second was getting close enough to hear her heartbeat. Outside the cage, one of the guards checked his watch. You're going to be a nice payday for the boss, he said. Assuming he gets you in one piece. Lena's lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. Big assumption. She felt the shift before it happened, the moment when the leader stepped forward, deciding to make a point. His hand reached for her chin, tilting her face upward in mock inspection. It was the opening she'd been waiting for. Later witnesses would argue about how long it took. Some swore it was over in less than a minute, others said it couldn't have been more than half that. All anyone agreed on was that when it ended, 6 men were on the ground, 3 unconscious, 2 bleeding, and 1 gasping for air with a shattered windpipe. And Lena Vex was walking toward the door, her wrists no longer bound. The air inside the warehouse still vibrated with the echo of violence. Bodies lay crumpled across the oil-stained floor, groaning or still, the sharp tang of blood mixing with the metallic bite of rust. Lena didn't look back. Her focus was on the door, heavy steel, chained from the outside, but with just enough give to promise a weakness. She stepped over the leader's twitching arm, grabbed a pry bar from the scattered tools along the wall, and wedged it between the door and the frame. Metal screamed as she levered it open just far enough to slip through. The outside air hit her like a wave, cold, salt-laden, and damp from the fog rolling in off the bay. Beyond the warehouse yard, the black water gleamed faintly under a shrouded moon. Somewhere out there, a low-throated ship's horn groaned in the distance. She knew she had minutes, maybe less, before the rest of them realized what had happened and mobilized. The men she'd dropped weren't dead, at least most weren't, and pain had a way of sharpening loyalty. If they didn't come after her out of orders, they'd do it for pride. Lena crossed the gravel yard quickly, keeping to the shadows between rusted shipping containers. Her boots made no more noise than the whisper of the fog moving between steel walls. Every few steps she glanced upward, scanning for snipers or sentries. Nothing yet. At the far edge of the yard, a chain-link fence topped with sagging barbed wire marked the perimeter. She checked both directions. To the left, the fence ended in a stretch of jagged shoreline, where rocks disappeared into the tide. To the right, the faint glow of street lamps marked the start of the industrial district. Noise drifted from behind the warehouse, shouts, the metallic clang of something being kicked over. They'd found the bodies. The clock had just started again. She opted for the shoreline, noise covered by the waves, visibility cut by the fog, fewer angles of approach for pursuit. She scaled the fence in seconds, using the sagging wire to swing over and drop to the rocky ground beyond. The tide was coming in, churning white around the black stones. She moved along the edge, keeping low, every muscle attuned to the balance between speed and silence. Halfway to the next pier, she spotted it, a small battered skiff tied to a rotting mooring post, no light, no crew, perfect. But as she reached for the rope, a voice cut through the fog. "Thought you'd try for the water." She turned slowly. Two figures stood on the rocks behind her, silhouettes backlit by the faint industrial glow. One carried a short-barrel shotgun, the other a heavy-bladed machete. Lena didn't flinch. Her eyes measured the distance, 7 meters to the first man, 9 to the second, 2 seconds to close the gap if she moved on the exhale. The shotgun wielder stepped forward. "Boss says you're worth more breathing than bleeding, but me, I don't really care either way." The machete man smiled, his teeth a pale slash in the dark. "She's not armed, this won't take long." They were wrong on both counts. When Lena moved, it was with the same precision she'd used in the warehouse, fast, surgical, absolute. The first man didn't even get the shotgun fully leveled before her hand snapped it aside and drove into his throat. The second barely raised the blade before his wrist was bent past its limit, and the weapon was in her hand. By the time the fog closed over them again, both men were down. The skiff's rope slipped free, and Lena pushed off into the current, the shore vanishing behind her like a fading nightmare. The skiff's small outboard motor coughed twice before catching, its low rumble swallowed by the rolling fog. Lena kept the throttle barely open, letting the current do most of the work as she slipped between shadowy piers and ghostly outlines of fishing boats tied up for the night. Her hands moved automatically, checking bearings, scanning the water for movement, but her mind was already ahead of her body, running through the next steps. The warehouse was only one piece of the net that had been thrown around her. There would be other teams, other choke points. If she didn't get to her contact before dawn, the window would close, and she'd vanish into whatever black site they'd prepared. The coastline bent inward, and she guided the skiff into a narrow inlet where a single green navigation light blinked lazily in the mist. The place smelled of brine and diesel, the water slick with the faint rainbow sheen of fuel. A shadow moved on the dock ahead, tall, lean and still as a piling. Lena cut the motor and let the boat drift until the skiff's bow nudged the rubber bumper on the dock's edge. "You're late," the man said quietly. His voice was deep, gravelly, the kind that came from years of shouting over engines and gunfire. "They started the party early," Lena replied, climbing onto the dock. She glanced around, no other movement, just the steady drip of water from the pilings and the distant creak of rigging on a moored trawler. The man stepped forward, into the docklight, revealing a weather-beaten face and eyes that still carried a soldier's edge. Commander Reese Calder, retired Navy, former handler, and one of the few people she trusted to still have his own moral compass. "You look like hell," he said, though there was a note of approval in his tone. "From what I hear, you left a trail of broken men behind you." "They started it," Lena said flatly. She pulled a small waterproof pouch from inside her jacket and handed it to him. Calder unzipped it, scanning the contents, a stack of micro drives, each marked with a hand-etched code. "Tell me this is what I think it is." "It's everything," she said. "Names, bank routes, movement logs, enough to burn the whole operation to the ground." Calder's jaw tightened. "Then they'll never stop coming for you." "I know." A sound drifted through the fog, the low rhythmic thump of a motorboat engine growing closer. Calder's eyes flicked toward the inlet mouth. "They found you faster than I thought." "How many?" Lena asked, already scanning for cover. "Too many for a straight fight." He nodded toward the end of the dock, where an old maintenance shed sat half collapsed under its own roof. "Inside. Go." They moved quickly, boots silent on the damp wood. The shed smelled of mildew and salt, its walls warped from years of storms, but it offered a single narrow window facing the water. Through it, Lena saw them, 3 boats fanning out as they entered the inlet, each one bristling with armed silhouettes. Floodlights cut through the fog, sweeping across the water in slow arcs. "They're not here for a talk," Calder said. "No," Lena replied, her eyes narrowing. "They're here to make sure I don't leave breathing." The first boat cut its engine 20 meters from the dock, coasting in on momentum. The other 2 fanned out, flanking the inlet to box them in. From the shed's warped window, Lena counted at least a dozen men, each armed, each moving with the confidence of people who thought they already owned the night. "They're trying to hem us in," Calder muttered, eyes sweeping the dock. "We won't last here." "Then we make sure they don't either," Lena replied. Her gaze flicked to the clutter around them, rusted anchor chain coiled in the corner, a cracked toolbox spilling wrenches and screwdrivers, a pair of long boat hooks, leaning against the wall. She grabbed the chain first, testing its weight, heavy enough to break bone, light enough to swing. Calder pulled a length of thick rope from a wall hook, tying a noose with practiced speed. Outside, boots thudded on the dock. Shadows passed the window, the faint creak of wood betraying their careful steps. Floodlight beams swept past the shed, momentarily blinding her before moving on. "Three to the left, two circling right," Calder whispered. "They'll breach both sides." Lena slid to the left wall, chain coiled loosely in her hands. She steadied her breathing, counting the footsteps until the latch on the shed door began to rattle. The first man through never saw it coming. The chain whipped across his jaw with a sickening crack, sending him sprawling into the dock rail. Before he hit the ground, Lena was already turning, catching the second man's rifle barrel and wrenching it free. She reversed it in her hands, but stroking him across the temple hard enough to drop him cold. On the right, Calder's rope snapped tight around an attacker's leg, yanking him off balance. The man hit the dock face first, his rifle clattering into the water. Calder finished him with a brutal kick to the ribs. Gunfire erupted from the boats, splinters flying as rounds punched through the shed walls. Lena ducked low, shoving Calder toward the far exit. "We move now, before they cut us in half." They burst out the back of the shed, the dock swaying under their combined weight. A man rounded the corner ahead, but Calder's shoulder charge sent him over the edge into the black water. Lena scooped up the man's dropped sidearm without breaking stride. The second boat was closing fast, its bow cutting a white V through the water. Two men stood at the front, rifles ready. Lena didn't hesitate. She took a knee, aimed and put 2 rounds through the first man's chest before he even saw her. The second dove for cover as bullets chewed the deck around him. Calder pulled her toward a narrow service pier jutting away from the main dock. "This way. There's an access ladder into the maintenance tunnels under the yard." "They'll follow," Lena warned, "then we make them regret it." They sprinted for the pier as shouts rose behind them, the enemy regrouping. The floodlights swung wildly now, searching, hunting, the beams slicing through the fog like blades. At the end of the pier, the ladder waited, slippery with algae, disappearing into the black water below. Calder went first, his boots vanishing into the shadows. Lena followed, gripping the pistol in one hand as the cold water closed over her boots. Above them, heavy footsteps pounded onto the pier. The enemy was seconds behind, and if Lena had her way, they'd be seconds from regret. The water was chest deep and freezing, the kind that seeped through fabric and into bone within minutes. The tunnel's walls were corrugated steel, slick with algae, the air thick with the smell of brine and rust. Every movement sent ripples down the passage, each sound amplified in the narrow space. Calder led the way, a small waterproof flashlight clenched between his teeth, its beam slicing through the murk. "Stay close," he said around the light. "They know this place exists. Question is how fast they'll come after us." Behind them, boots clanged onto the ladder. Lena didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sound of metal on metal told her everything she needed to know. They were in, and they were armed. She shifted the pistol in her hand, keeping it above water. 6 rounds left, not enough for what was coming. The tunnel curved ahead, opening into a wider chamber, where rusted maintenance catwalks crisscrossed above the water line. Calder hauled himself onto one of the low platforms, then reached down to pull her up beside him. "Gives us a height advantage," he said quietly. She nodded, scanning the shadows. Pipes dripped steadily overhead, each drop hitting the water with a hollow plunk. Somewhere behind, voices echoed, sharp, urgent, closing fast. Lena spotted a length of loose pipe leaning against the wall. She picked it up, testing the weight. Not elegant, but it would shatter a jaw as easily as a bone-handled blade. The first pursuer splashed into view moments later, rifle high, scanning the catwalks. He never got the chance to aim. Calder dropped from above, driving him under the surface with a crash that sent water spraying across the chamber. The man didn't come back up. Two more appeared almost immediately, firing upward. Rounds pinged off the steel grating, one zipping past Lena's ear close enough to sting. She rolled behind a support column, steadied her breath, and fired twice. One man dropped, clutching his side. The other ducked out of view. Calder grabbed her arm. "We can't hold this position. Too many angles." They moved deeper into the tunnels, water sloshing around their boots. The sound of pursuit was relentless. Shouts, splashes, the heavy clatter of weapons against walls. Lena slowed as they reached another junction, eyes narrowing at the overhead pipes. One of them sagged, corroded nearly through. She holstered the pistol and motioned for Calder to boost her up. "What are you? Trust me." She swung the pipe she carried into the weakened joint. It gave with a groan, and suddenly a torrent of freezing seawater roared down the tunnel behind them. The force was enough to sweep the pursuers off their feet, dragging them back toward the inlet like rag dolls. The sudden silence that followed was almost deafening. Calder let out a low whistle. "Effective. Temporary," she said, dropping back into the water. "They'll regroup. We move." They pressed on until the tunnel sloped upward, the water line dropping to their knees. Ahead, a faint rectangle of light marked an exit hatch. But as they drew closer, Lena's instincts prickled. The hatch wasn't just a way out, it was also an ambush point. And if she was right, stepping into that light might be the most dangerous move of the night. The glow spilling through the hatch wasn't the warm yellow of street lamps. It was cold, sterile, LED floodlights, the kind used in tactical operations. Lena froze halfway up the incline, one hand lifted in warning to Calder. "They're waiting," she murmured. He didn't ask how she knew. Years in the field taught a man to read danger in posture, in stillness, in the way the light didn't waver even when it should. She scanned the tunnel walls. Rust streaks, riveted seams, nothing obvious for cover except the knee-high water they stood in. That she could use. "You've got 2 smoke charges left," she asked quietly. Calder patted his vest. "1, and a flash. Flash. First. On my mark." They crept up the final meters until the hatch loomed overhead, a round riveted disc bolted into the ceiling with a crank wheel on the inside. Voices murmured above them, just out of range, but the scrape of boots on metal grated against her nerves. She nodded once. Calder yanked the flashbang from his vest, twisted the pin free, and hurled it upward as Lena spun the hatch wheel. The door swung open, and light exploded, a white-hot burst accompanied by the concussive crack that made the steel walls ring. Shouts erupted above, muffled by the ringing in her own ears. She surged up through the hatch, pipe still in hand. The first man she saw was staggering, weapon loose in his grip, eyes clenched shut from the flash. She drove the end of the pipe into his gut, then pivoted to smash it across the temple of another. 2 more dropped to their knees, clutching their faces. Calder came through behind her, rifle leveled, putting controlled bursts into anyone still moving. In less than 10 seconds, the rooftop above the hatch was littered with bodies, some moaning, some very still. The light revealed where they were, the upper deck of a gutted cargo facility, its roof open to the night. From here, Lena could see the skeletal cranes of the dockyard and the far-off glimmer of the city beyond. "Up high," Calder warned. She followed his gaze to the opposite crane boom, where 2 silhouettes crouched against the steel lattice. Snipers. One shot cracked, splintering the hatch rim beside her head. Lena dropped flat, dragging Calder down with her. "We can't stay here," he growled. "No," she agreed. "But I can make them move." She yanked a flare from the belt of one of the downed men, struck it, and rolled it across the deck toward a stack of oil drums. The snipers hesitated, just long enough for the flare to ignite a thin slick of leaked fuel. Flames leapt high, curling black smoke into the night. Shouts echoed from somewhere below as the fire took hold, heat washing across the deck. Down the service stairs, Lena shouted over the roar. They bolted for the stairwell as another shot rang out. this one wild and wide through the haze. The flames were already drawing attention from across the yard, more men converging, more boots pounding on steel. By the time Lena and Calder hit the ground level, the chaos above was complete. The fire had become both cover and signal, and every armed man in the dockyard would be looking for them. She checked her pistol, 3 rounds left. The odds were getting thinner by the step. The ground-level yard was a labyrinth of towering cargo containers, their sides streaked with rust and salt. Narrow lanes wound between them, some no wider than a man's shoulders, others opening into sudden pockets of moonlit space. It was the kind of place where sound ricocheted, where every footstep might be your own, or someone else's closing in. Lena moved first, keeping her shoulders grazing the steel walls, eyes darting between high angles and shadowed corners. Calder followed, rifle sweeping methodically, the muted thump of boots on packed gravel their only steady rhythm. Behind them, the fire crackled somewhere up on the deck they'd left, punctuated by the faint pop of ammunition cooking off in the heat. The distraction was working, but it was also pulling more men into the yard, and Lena could feel the net tightening. Left, Calder whispered, jerking his head toward a side lane. They slipped into it, the shadows swallowing them whole. Halfway down, voices drifted toward them, low, urgent, moving fast. Lena raised a hand, signaling stop. The voices multiplied, footsteps converging from both ends of the lane. "They're trying to box us again," Calder murmured. She scanned the walls. Every container was stacked 3, sometimes 4 high. A short ladder hung from the side of one, leading up to the second tier. Without a word, she pointed. They climbed quickly, keeping low as they reached the top of the first row. From here, the steel maze stretched out in every direction, a patchwork of walkable surfaces and gaps that dropped into darkness. 2 men rounded into the lane below, just as Lena and Calder flattened themselves along the roof. One passed directly beneath her. She waited until his head was aligned with the shadow of the ladder, then swung down silently, catching him by the collar and driving him into the gravel. The other spun at the noise, rifle rising, but Calder was already on him. 2 quick strikes with the rifle butt, and the men crumpled. They dragged the bodies into a dark recess and kept moving along the container tops. The high vantage gave them better sight lines, but it also left them exposed if anyone thought to look up. A sudden burst of automatic fire tore into the containers ahead, metal sparking in the dark. They dropped flat, the rounds whining overhead. The shooter was close, too close to flank without giving away their position. Lena's eyes caught a shadow to the right, a gap between containers just wide enough to slip through, leading down into a low, narrow passage. She motioned, and they slid into it, the steel walls closing tight around them. It was darker here, the light from above barely filtering through. They moved in silence, the smell of oil and wet rope heavy in the air. Somewhere nearby, the faint drip of water marked a break in the container line, maybe a drain, maybe an exit. They emerged into a larger open space, ringed by containers on 3 sides, and the corrugated wall of a warehouse on the 4th. The place was empty. Too empty. Lena froze, scanning the shadows. That's when she heard it, the soft click of a safety being switched off, right behind them. The click was followed by a voice, low and self-assured. "Drop the gun, Vex." Lena didn't turn immediately. Her peripheral vision painted the picture. 3 men, all close enough that she could smell the cordite, lingering on their gear. The one directly behind her was the speaker, barrel pressed just inside her shoulder blade. The other 2 were angled to the sides, cutting off escape. Calder stood tense beside her, his own rifle halfway lowered. "They want us breathing," he muttered. "Maybe," Lena said, "or maybe they want us slow." The man behind her barked a short laugh. "You're not in control here." Lena finally turned her head enough to meet his eyes. 45 seconds. He frowned, just like the first man back in the world. "That's all I'll need," she said. Before he could process it, she shifted her weight forward, snapping her elbow back into his jaw, with a wet crack. The rifle in his hands tilted, and she caught it on the rebound, twisting it free. The momentum carried her into the nearest side attacker. She drove the rifle butt into his sternum, doubling him over, then swept his legs out with a low kick. Calder moved at the same instant, stepping into the third man's line of fire, wrenching the barrel away, and slamming the stock into the man's temple. The first was still reeling, blood spraying from a split lip. Lena reversed the rifle in her hands, fired once shoulder hit, enough to drop him without killing. The second lunged for her, knife flashing, but she sidestepped, catching his wrist and spinning him face first into the corrugated wall. The clang rang out across the yard as he crumpled. A fourth man appeared at the container gap, weapon raised. Lena dove low, sliding across the gravel, bringing her sights up as she came out of the slide. 2 shots, center mass, dropped him before he could squeeze off a round. The silence that followed was heavy, the only sound their breathing. Lena glanced at Calder. Time? He checked his watch. 42 seconds. She allowed herself the faintest smirk, getting faster. They stepped over the bodies, gathering what weapons and ammo they could. Her pistol was now fully reloaded. Calder swapped out for a compact SMG one of the men had been carrying. But the fight hadn't gone unheard. Distant shouts and the sharp ping of radio chatter rippled through the steel maze. The sound was coming from multiple directions now. They were adapting, tightening the hunt. "We need height," Lena said, "somewhere with a line of sight on the whole yard." Calder scanned upward. "The south crane. It's got an operator's cabin halfway up. Could give us eyes and cover. Then we move." They vanished back into the shadowed lanes, the echo of their 45-second fight already drawing the next wave of predators. The south crane loomed over the yard like a steel giant, its skeletal frame cutting jagged lines against the smoke-choked moon. From this distance, Lena could already see the operator's cabin, a small box of glass and rusted metal perched halfway up the vertical tower. They broke into a sprint, boots pounding across gravel, and steel grating. The shouts behind them sharpened, and the rattle of gunfire burst through the air. Rounds sparked off the container walls, forcing them to duck and weave between the narrow lanes. The crane's base was surrounded by stacks of heavy cable spools, some wrapped in plastic, others left bare to weather. Lena slid behind one as a burst of rounds chewed the gravel, where she'd been a heartbeat earlier. "They've got angles on us from both sides," Calder said, peering past the spool. "They'll pin us here if we don't move." "Then we go up now," she replied. "Stay low until the ladder." They darted for the crane's steel ladder, hugging the shadow of the frame. Lena went first, her hands gripping the cold rungs, boots finding purchase on the crossbeams. Calder followed close, his SMG slung across his chest. The first 10 meters were open, no cover, just them exposed on the side of the crane. Bullets whined past, one slamming into the metal so close it sent vibrations through the ladder. Halfway up, Lena stopped abruptly, pressing herself flat against the side. A shooter had taken position on a container stack directly ahead, his rifle leveled at them. She could see the faint glint of his scope in the haze. "Keep climbing," Calder said, but Lena shook her head. Instead she reached for the flare gun she'd taken earlier from a downed enemy. She braced it against the ladder, and fired. The flare streaked red through the air, smashing into the shooter's position. The burst of light and heat forced him back, giving them the seconds they needed to keep moving. They reached a narrow catwalk bolted to the crane's side, ducking behind its railing, as more fire erupted from below. The sound was deafening, every shot reverberating through the steel. "Go," Calder urged, and they climbed again, the cabin now less than 10 meters above. The wind picked up at this height, carrying the smell of smoke and diesel from the burning deck they'd left earlier. Another burst of fire ripped upward from below, punching through the grating under their boots. Lena almost lost her grip as a round grazed her arm, tearing fabric but missing flesh. She gritted her teeth and hauled herself the last few meters, grabbing the cabin's doorway and swinging inside. Calder landed behind her, immediately dropping to one knee and sweeping the outside for threats. The cabin was cramped and littered with old equipment, dusty levers, cracked gauges, and a long-forgotten thermos rolling on the floor. But it had 2 advantages. a full view of the yard and a door they could barricade. Lena shoved an overturned chair against the frame, while Calder set his rifle on the sill. From up here, they could see the enemy spreading through the steel maze below, a dozen flashlights cutting white lines through the smoke. They're tightening the noose, Calder said. Lena nodded, eyes narrowing. Then we cut the rope. The enemy spread below them, like black ants across the steel maze, flashlights bobbing as they closed in. From this height, Lena could see their patterns, three-man teams leapfrogging through the lanes, rifles ready, cutting off every escape. Calder adjusted his rifle, sighting down on a squad near the crane's base. I can drop 2, maybe 3 before they scatter. But it won't be enough. Lena's gaze swept the cabin, old control levers, cracked but still labeled in fading paint. One was marked boom swing, another load winch. She set her hands on the boom lever. You ever use one of these in a fight? Calder's lips curled into the faintest grin. No, but I'd like to. She yanked the lever, and with a groan of strained metal, the crane's massive arm began to swing. Its hook and chain dangled over the container stacks, the steel cable humming under the strain. The first sweep knocked a searchlight clean off its tripod, sending it crashing into the gravel. Shouts erupted from below as beams of light danced wildly in the chaos. Lena pulled the boom the other way, building momentum. On the next swing, the hook slammed into the side of a stacked container, crumpling the steel wall like a tin can. The force toppled the top container, sending it crashing down into the lane where 2 men had been seconds earlier. Gunfire erupted upward, rounds pinging off the crane's frame. Calder returned fire in controlled bursts, dropping anyone who dared get close to the ladder. You're making a mess of their map, he said, between shots. That's the idea, Lena replied, yanking the lever again. This time, she lowered the hook as she swung, catching the corner of a container, and dragging it half off its stack. Gravity did the rest, the container slamming into the ground with a deafening crash that sent dust and sparks into the air. The enemy's advance slowed, their formations breaking apart in the confusion. But the crane's groaning gears told her she wouldn't get many more swings before something seized. We can't stay up here forever, Calder warned. They'll just box us in again. Lena's eyes tracked the chaos below, then settled on a gap, a narrow lane that now lay unguarded thanks to the toppled stacks. It led toward the far side of the yard, where the shadows thickened into what looked like a service road. She let the boom swing one last time, sending the hook into a final container stack, and then killed the control. Time to go. They shoved the chair from the doorway, and climbed down the opposite side of the crane, using its framework as cover. The descent was faster, more dangerous, every rung slick with condensation, every movement under the risk of fire from below. Halfway down, a shout went up. They'd been spotted. Bullets tore into the crane's side, one round sparking inches from Lena's hand. She dropped the last 5 meters, landing in a crouch, and immediately broke into a sprint toward the unguarded lane. Calder hit the ground behind her, covering their flank as they weaved between toppled containers and scattered debris. The chaos in the yard was still unfolding behind them, but Lena knew it wouldn't last. They'd get their order back, and when they did, the hunt would be worse than before. For now though, the road ahead was open, and she planned to take it. The service road stretched ahead in a ribbon of cracked asphalt, lined on one side by looming warehouses, and on the other by the skeletal remains of abandoned cranes. Puddles from the evening tide reflected the cold glow of security lights, each one flickering like a faulty heartbeat. Lena slowed, her breathing measured. This road's too open. They'll see us the second they swing around the yard. Calder's eyes scanned the shadows. Then we stay ahead of them, keep moving before they reset the perimeter. A low rumble reached them, an engine, not the high-pitched whine of a motorbike, but the deeper growl of something heavier. The sound came from behind the nearest warehouse, growing louder with every second. Lena pressed herself against the corrugated wall, peering around the corner. A black utility truck rolled into view, its flatbed lined with gear crates. 2 men rode up front, and another stood on the back.
gripping the roof rail with one hand and an SMG in the other. "They're not looking for us yet," Calder whispered. "But they will be." Lena's gaze swept the scene. There was a narrow gap between two warehouses about 50 meters ahead. If they could make it there unseen, they could use the buildings as cover. "On my count," she said. They moved low and fast, boots silent on the cracked road. The truck's headlights carved white arcs across the yard, sweeping dangerously close as they neared the gap. They were 10 meters from cover when the man on the flatbed spotted movement. He shouted something and swung his weapon toward them. Lena didn't think. She pivoted on her heel and fired 3 quick shots. The man jerked back, dropping into the truck bed as Calder grabbed her arm and yanked her into the gap. Bullets shredded the warehouse wall as the truck skidded sideways, trying to block their pass. Lena and Calder bolted through the alley, weaving between rusted barrels and stacks of rotting pallets. The alley spilled them out into another open lot, this one cluttered with old forklifts, shipping crates, and the skeletal shells of boats propped on cradles. The smell of salt and oil was heavy here, mingling with the faint stench of decay. The truck roared in from the side, tires screaming as it swerved toward them. Lena didn't hesitate. She grabbed Calder's shoulder and shoved him toward a low forklift. "Get in." Calder swung into the driver's seat, while she vaulted onto the back. The forklift's old diesel engine coughed once before roaring to life, belching a cloud of black smoke. The truck accelerated, closing the gap. Calder threw the forklift into gear, the machine lumbering forward with surprising speed. It wasn't built for pursuit, but in the cluttered lot, speed wasn't the point. Maneuverability was. They swerved between the cradled boats just as the truck tried to follow, its wider frame smashing into one of the supports. The impact tore a hull free, the boat crashing down in a spray of splinters and fiberglass dust, blocking part of the lot. "Nice," Lena said, gripping the forklift's railing, as they veered left toward a break in the fence. The truck recovered, backing up for another push, but the gap in the fence was too narrow for it to follow. Calder aimed the forklift straight through, metal squealing as the sides scraped against rusted wire. They burst out onto a gravel access lane, beyond the lot. The road curved toward a low pier that jutted into the black water. "They'll be right behind us," Calder warned. Lena's eyes fixed on the pier. "Then we take the fight somewhere they can't corner us." The pier stretched like a finger into the dark water, its weathered planks slick with algae and spray. Old fishing nets hung from warp posts, tangling in the breeze, and the faint clang of metal buoy chains carried over the waves. Calder steered the forklift to the end, cutting the engine beside a stack of lobster traps. The night air was colder here, sharper, the salt biting at Lena's skin. "They'll trap us," Calder said quietly, scanning the empty horizon. "Only one way off this pier, and it's back through them." "Unless we change the rules," Lena replied. She scanned the clutter for anything useful. A rusted harpoon gun sat half buried under a tarp. 2 coiled lengths of heavy mooring rope. An oil drum with a faded hazard symbol. The roar of the truck's engine grew louder, headlights bouncing off the waves as it tore down the access lane toward them. Behind it, flashlights bobbed in the dark. On foot, more men closing in. Lena moved fast. She hauled the harpoon gun onto an overturned crate, checking the line still spooled around its base. The mechanism was old, but the trigger pull felt clean enough. Calder upended the oil drum, tipping it toward the edge of the pier. The thick liquid sloshed sluggishly, dribbling over the edge into the water below. "Planning to light it?" Lena asked. "If we need to," Calder said. The truck hit the pier at speed, its tires thudding against the planks. The wood groaned under the weight. Men shouted from the back, weapons rising. Lena didn't wait. She leveled the harpoon gun and fired. The spear shot out with a heavy thunk, burying itself in the truck's front grille. The attached line snapped taut, jerking the vehicle's momentum and skewing it sideways. Calder dove forward, wrapping the line around a heavy pier post. The truck's tires spun, the wood beneath it splintering as the engine roared. Men began jumping from the flatbed, boots pounding toward them. Lena dropped the harpoon and snatched up the mooring rope. She swung it low, catching the legs of the first attacker, and yanking hard. He crashed face first onto the planks, weapon skittering into the dark water. Calder took the second man, driving a shoulder into his gut, and sending him tumbling over the edge into the black waves. The splash was swallowed almost instantly by the night. Gunfire erupted from the pier's midpoint. Lena dove behind the lobster traps as splinters exploded around her. She drew her pistol, firing back in controlled pairs, forcing the shooters to duck. The truck's engine screamed one last time before stalling completely, smoke pouring from under its hood. The harpoon line still held, the vehicle locked in place like a trap beast. One of the shooters tried to flank from the left, using the fishing nets as cover. Lena fired once, clean through the netting, and he dropped. The last man on the pier charged, knife glinting in the dock lights. Lena sidestepped, caught his wrist, and twisted until the blade clattered to the boards. A sharp knee to the ribs folded him, and she shoved him into the water. Silence fell except for the lapping of waves against the pier. The truck sat dead, its headlights casting long useless beams into the water. Calder looked at her. They'll regroup. We've got maybe 2 minutes before the next wave. Then we're not here when they come, Lena said, already eyeing the moored skiff bobbing at the pier's far end.
The skiff was small, little more than an open fishing boat with an outboard motor bolted to the stern, but it would float, and more importantly, it would move.
Nina untied the mooring rope while Calder gave the starter cord a violent pull.
The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, rattling the wooden frame beneath their feet. They shoved off just as the first shouts echoed from the pier's far end. Flashlights and muzzle flashes cut through the dark as rounds punched into the water around them, sending up sharp sprays. Lena crouched low, using the gunwale for cover while Calder pushed the throttle forward. The skiff surged into the black water, its wake glowing faintly in the dock lights. Behind them the pier was shrinking fast, but the enemy wasn't giving up. Spotlights flared from the yard, sweeping across the harbor, their beams stabbing into the night. Calder steered hard to the left, weaving through the pilings of an old dock to break the line of sight. The spotlight beams swung wildly, trying to track them, but within moments the deeper roar of other engines joined the night air. "Pursuit boats," Lena said grimly. 2 black ribes, rigid inflatable boats, shot out from the shadows beyond the pier, their bows bouncing against the chop as they gunned toward the skiff. Each carried 3 men, all armed, all leaning forward with predator focus. Lena knelt at the bow, her pistol braced in both hands. The first RB drew close enough for her to see the glint of goggles on the driver. She squeezed off 3 shots. One sparked off the hull, the second took the man beside the driver, and the third punched into the driver's shoulder. The RB veered sharply, skidding across the water before regaining control, but the second boat was closing in from the opposite side. "They're trying to flank," Calder shouted over the engine's growl, "then we don't give them the angle." She pointed toward a narrow channel between 2 rusting cargo barges anchored mid-harbor. Calder didn't hesitate. He spun the skiff toward it, the motor screaming as they raced for the gap. The RB behind them surged forward, its bow wake slapping hard against the skiff's stern. One of the gunmen stood, SMG raised, firing in short, vicious bursts. Rounds punched into the hull, one grazing Lena's shoulder in a burning line. She gritted her teeth, turned, and fired back. The man toppled into the dark water without a sound. They hit the channel between the barges, the sound of water slapping against steel echoing in the confined space. Calder cut the throttle just enough to maneuver, the skiff scraping dangerously close to the barge walls. The first RB tried to follow but clipped aside, ripping a tear in its inflatable collar. Water sprayed into the air as it veered off, struggling to stay afloat. The second RB, still intact, pushed through the gap after them. Lena waited until it was halfway in before grabbing the mooring rope from the bottom of the skiff. She looped it around a rusted cleat on the barge wall, then let the loose end trail into the water. As the RB closed, its bow snagged the rope at full speed. The sudden tension whipped the boat sideways, slamming it into the barge with bone-jarring force. 2 of the gunmen were thrown into the channel, the third lay dazed against the console. Calder didn't wait to admire the work. He gunned the motor again, blasting them out the far end of the channel and into open water. The harbor behind them was chaos now. Fire still burned from the crane yard. Spotlights stabbed uselessly across the waves, and the sound of shouting carried over the wind. Lena sank onto the bench, breathing hard. That's 2 waves down. Calder nodded, eyes fixed ahead, which means the next one will be worse. The thumping came first, a low rhythmic pulse that seemed to rise from the water itself. Lena's head lifted, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. It wasn't the chop, it was rotors. Calder's gaze followed hers. They brought a bird. A helicopter emerged from the smoke-shrouded yard, its running lights blinking red and green against the night sky. A blinding white searchlight cut downward, slicing across the waves like a sword of light. It swept left, then right, and when it caught the glint of the skiff's wet hull, it locked on. "Hold on," Calder shouted. He threw the skiff into a sharp turn, the motor whining as the hull slapped hard against the swells. The searchlight tracked them perfectly, the helicopter banking to match their movement. Lena could see the muzzle protruding from the bird's open side door, a mounted machine gun, manned and ready. The first burst came without warning. The water around them exploded in white geysers, the rounds hammering the sea in a lethal pattern. She dropped flat on the skiff's deck. "They're hurting us." Calder's jaw was set. "Then we make them chase somewhere they can't follow." He steered toward the far side of the harbor, where the hulking shapes of derelict ships sat half-sunk in the shallows. The skeletal remains of their masts and superstructures jutted out at odd angles, creating a jagged obstacle field. The helicopter followed, its searchlight shaking over the uneven waves. More gunfire ripped into the water, one burst chewing into the skiff's bow, and sending shards of wood flying past Lena's face. She grabbed the harpoon gun still lying at her feet. Its spool was empty, but the spear remained loaded. It wouldn't bring down the bird, but it could ruin the gunner's aim. "Get me close to the wrecks," she shouted. Calder weaved through the rusting giants, the skiff scraping past barnacle-encrusted hulls. The helicopter dipped lower to keep sight, rotors churning spray into the air. Lena braced herself against the gunwale, aimed upward, and fired. The spear arced through the mist and smashed into the open doorway of the helicopter. It didn't hit the gunner, but it forced him to jerk back, breaking his aim and giving them a precious few seconds. Calder seized the moment, cutting hard toward a gap between 2 leaning ships. The helicopter tried to follow but had to pull up to avoid the jagged mass jutting from the water. The searchlight broke off them for the first time since the chase began. They shot through the gap into calmer water, the wrecks shielding them from overhead sightlines. Calder throttled down, letting the skiff drift into the shadows of a half-collapsed cargo hulk. The helicopter's searchlight swept the other side of the wreck, beams stabbing into empty water. The thump of rotors grew fainter as it pulled away, convinced they'd lost the trail. Lena exhaled slowly, her heart still hammering. "That's 3 waves down." Calder looked at her, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through the tension. "Which means the last one will be personal." The wreck's shadow clung to them like a cloak, but Lena knew it wouldn't last. Men like the ones hunting them didn't stop. They adapted, tracked, closed in. And the next time they found her, they wouldn't bring boats or helicopters. They'd come themselves. Calder shut off the engine completely. The skiff drifted soundlessly, the only noise the slap of water against the rusted hull beside them. "Your call," he said quietly. "We don't run," Lena replied. "We end it here." They checked their weapons in silence. Lena had her pistol, 1 spare mag, and a knife she'd pulled from the man on the pier. Calder carried the SMG, 2 half-full magazines, and a collapsible baton. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The sound reached them first, 2 smaller engines, approaching slow. Lena crouched, peering around the jagged edge of the wreck. 2 narrow boats nosed into the cove between the derelicts, each carrying 3 men in dark tactical gear. They cut their engines 20 meters out, and paddled the rest of the way, trying to be silent. 1 boat split left, the other right, moving to box the skiff against the wreck. "Wait until they commit," Lena murmured. The first boat came alongside, 1 man reaching out to grab the gunwale. Lena lunged forward, slashing his arm before he could pull back. He screamed, and she shoved him into the water. The second man on the boat swung his rifle toward her, but Calder's SMG barked, dropping him instantly. The third dove into the wreck's shadow, disappearing from sight. From the other side, the second boat surged in. Lena dropped low as a burst of rounds shredded the skiff's side. She rolled to the far gunwale and fired upward, catching one man in the chest. The last two jumped aboard, turning the skiff into a cramped killing ground. One swung a rifle like a club, catching Calder across the jaw. Calder staggered, but recovered fast, driving his baton into the man's knee with a crack that folded him in half. The final attacker came at Lena with a combat knife, the blade flashing in the dim light. She caught his wrist, twisted, and slammed her forehead into his nose. Blood sprayed, and she ripped the knife free, burying it into his side before shoving him into the water. The cove was silent again, only the sound of waves slapping against metal, and the ragged breathing of two survivors. The bodies drifted, some sinking, others caught on the wreck's barnacled edges. Calder wiped blood from his lip. Think that's all of them. Lena scanned the dark water, the open harbor beyond. For now, she restarted the engine, the skiff humming to life. They eased out of the cove, slipping into the open sea without another glance back. Somewhere behind them, the yard still burned, the crane yard still smoldered, and the men who thought they could cage her were either gone, or feeding the tide. Calder leaned back against the bench, eyes on her. You dropped 6 men in 45 seconds back there. Lena allowed herself the smallest smile. And I didn't even have my weapons. The skiff's wake stretched out behind them like a white scar, fading into the darkness. The cell smelled of cold metal and disinfectant, a sterile box meant to strip a person of dignity before the real damage began. She sat in the center, hands cuffed to the bolted chair, hair hanging loose over her face. They'd taken her weapons, her armor, her boots. They thought they'd taken everything. The door opened with a slow hiss, and 3 men stepped inside, faces hard, eyes scanning her like a specimen. Behind them, a 4th man wheeled in a steel cart draped with a canvas sheet. The faint clink of metal underneath told her everything she needed to know. Former Sergeant Cassia Vale, the tallest one said, reading from a clipboard. Discharged, dishonored, disappeared, and now conveniently found snooping in restricted territory. She said nothing. The less they thought they knew, the longer she had to read them. The man in charge, she marked him as the talker circled her slowly. You've made a career out of violence. I wonder what you'll do without your toys. He tapped the cuffs. Nothing, I suspect. They thought this was a chess match. They didn't realize she was already several moves ahead. When the talker leaned in close, she let her head hang lower, hiding the smile that crept across her face. You're assuming I need toys, she said softly. The other men chuckled. The talker didn't. Let's start, he ordered. The man with the cart pulled away the sheet, revealing a neat line of blunt instruments, electrical cables, and restraints. It was meant to intimidate, to break her before they laid a hand on her. It didn't work. She'd seen worse in places these men couldn't survive 5 minutes. They started with questions, the kind designed to wear down answers over hours. She gave them nothing, just the occasional shrug or blank stare. Her focus wasn't on their words, it was on their feet, how they shifted, where the weight was, which one favored his left knee, which one couldn't resist glancing toward the door every few seconds. They didn't notice her testing the cuffs, feeling the micro given the bolts that held them to the chair. They didn't notice her breathing slow, coiling her body like a spring. When the talker finally stepped close enough, placing his hand on the back of her chair to loom over her, she moved. The chair rocked forward, and with a sharp twist, the weakened bolt snapped free. She surged upward, the steel cuffs still on her wrists, but now a weapon of their own. The first man dropped before he realized she'd hit him, forehead to nose, blood spraying as he collapsed backward. The second lunged with a baton, but she caught his wrist in the chain between her cuffs and wrenched it until bone cracked. The baton was hers now. The talker went for his sidearm, but she swept his legs and drove the baton into his throat before he could clear the holster. The fourth man barely had time to turn before she hurled the cuffs into his jaw, dropping him like a stone. 4 down in under 10 seconds. She crouched to strip a pistol from the talker's holster and leveled it at the camera in the corner of the room. Your move, she said. The door lock clicked open again, not from the inside, from someone letting her out. The door swung inward, and she didn't hesitate, pivoting low, pistol raised,
ready to fire. But the figure in the doorway wasn't one of her captors. It was a man in fatigues, face partially hidden by a hood, an old field radio slung over his shoulder. "Move," he said, voice clipped and urgent. She didn't ask who he was, or why he was there. Questions could wait, if they made it out alive. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering, with each surge of failing power. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to wail, a slow, rising tone that told her their little prison brawl hadn't gone unnoticed. They moved fast, her guide leading the way through a maze of corridors that smelled of oil and damp concrete. Every turn was a risk. She expected armed guards to appear at any second. Instead, the halls remained eerily empty. "Where is everyone?" she asked between breaths. "They've been pulled to the east side," he said. "Something hit their perimeter. I made sure it happened." Her eyes narrowed. "You planned this. Let's just say you weren't the only one they took that shouldn't be here." They reached a locked steel door. He punched a code into the keypad, and the lock disengaged with a heavy thunk. Beyond was a narrow service tunnel, the kind used for maintenance crews, and for moving things they didn't want seen. The air was colder here, the walls lined with cables and pipes that dripped condensation. The sound of boots on concrete echoed unnaturally, making it impossible to tell if someone was behind them. Halfway through the tunnel, she stopped. "You know my name," she said flatly. "Who are you?" He turned just enough for her to see his eyes, sharp, calculating, but tired. "Call me Ash. I was sent to find you before they moved you off-site. If they had, this rescue wouldn't have been possible." "Sent by who?" He shook his head. "Later. Right now we need to get you armed." Her mind was racing. No one outside her old unit should have even known she was here. And if Ash was telling the truth, someone had been tracking her since before her capture. They exited the tunnel into what looked like an underground storage bay. Rows of crates lined the walls, stenciled with codes and unit numbers she recognized from Black Book operations. She popped the latch on the nearest one. Inside was a neatly packed set of weapons, including a suppressed SMG and a combat knife. The weight of the SMG, in her hands, felt like breathing again. She slung the extra mags over her shoulder, and turned to Ash. "What now?" "Now," he said, "we blow their comms hub, and make sure no one follows us." As if on cue, shouts echoed from the tunnel they'd just left. Boots pounded against the concrete, growing louder. She smiled, chambered around, and took position behind the nearest crate. "Looks like we're doing it the loud way." The first guard through the doorway didn't even make it 2 steps before her rounds dropped him. Ash moved like a shadow, his suppressed pistol spitting in precise bursts. The storage bay became a trap, every crate and steel column turning into cover as they cut down the guards who flooded in. When the last body hit the floor, she reloaded without looking, scanning for the next threat. Ash was already moving toward a stairwell at the far end. "This way, comms hub's 3 floors up. We end this before they regroup." And in her mind she knew, if Ash was real, if this was more than luck, then this fight had just grown far bigger than the 6 men she'd dropped in 45 seconds. The stairwell smelled of rust and damp concrete, every step creaking under their boots as they climbed. She could hear the faint hum of machinery above them, growing louder with each floor. If Ash was right, that sound was the heart of the facility's communications hub, the place that kept this whole operation linked to the outside world. They paused on the landing of the 2nd floor, pressed flat against the wall as a squad of guards passed on the opposite catwalk. Ash held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward a maintenance ladder tucked into the shadows, faster than the stairs. Less exposed, she slung her SMG across her back, and climbed first, boots slipping slightly on the slick rungs. The air grew warmer, thick with the ozone bite of active electronics. When she reached the top, she peered through the grated hatch. The comms hub was massive, rows of servers blinking with green and amber lights, cables snaking across the floor, like vines. At the far end, a bank of screens displayed satellite feeds, encrypted messages, and maps littered with red markers. Even at a glance, she recognized some of those locations. They weren't random. They were bases, safe houses, and supply points for Black Ops groups she'd thought were unrelated. Ash emerged behind her, jaw tight as his eyes scanned the room. "They're not just running their own network," he whispered. "They're coordinating multiple rogue units." That meant the prison wasn't a side project, it was a node in something far bigger. If they shut down the hub, it wouldn't just cripple the people who had captured her. It could unravel an entire shadow network. The problem was the guards. 2 were stationed at the door, another patrolled the central aisle between the server racks, and a 4th sat at the control console. Any one of them could hit the alarm and lock the place down. She tapped Ash on the shoulder. "Split entry. I'll take the left, you handle right. Quiet until I can't be quiet." They moved like smoke, each step landing without sound. She slipped behind the first guard and drove her knife upward under the jawline, catching his body before it could fall. Ash's pistol whispered twice, and the 2 on his side crumpled silently. The 4th turned in his chair, eyes widening. Too late. Her suppressed SMG coughed 3 times, stitching a neat pattern across his chest. The room fell still, except for the steady hum of the machines. Ash was already pulling a satchel from his pack, small, black, and heavy. "Explosives. How long?" she asked. 3 minutes. Once it blows, every connected node goes blind." She scanned the screens again, one feed catching her attention, a live video from what looked like an airstrip. 2 cargo planes sat on the tarmac, crates being loaded under armed watch. In the corner of the feed was a timestamp, less than an hour from now. "Whatever's on those planes," she said, "it's part of the same network." Ash hesitated, then handed her a flash drive. "Download what you can. If we can't stop them, we need to at least know where they're going." She worked fast, pulling files, maps and encrypted comm logs onto the drive. Some of the names she saw made her blood run cold. People in positions of power, the kind who could make enemies vanish without a ripple. When Ash signaled 30 seconds, she ejected the drive and slid it into her pocket. They sprinted back to the hatch, dropping into the stairwell just as the explosives began their final countdown. The blast shook the building, a low, rolling roar that sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Somewhere below, alarms screamed to life. But the screens in the hub were gone, dark, silent, blind. Ash gave her a tight smile. 1 node down. She didn't smile back. She was still thinking about the airstrip, and what kind of storm they'd just started. They hit the ground floor, running. The facility was chaos, guards shouting over radios, klaxons blaring, smoke from the comms hub explosion drifting through the upper vents. Somewhere deep inside, backup generators rumbled to life, but it was too late for them. The network was already blind. Ash led the way through a side exit into the night air. The cold bit at her face, and for the first time since her capture, she could see the stars unobstructed. Beyond the perimeter fence, a battered military jeep waited, its engine idling. "Stolen?" she asked, as they climbed in. "Borrowed," Ash replied, throwing it into gear. "Airstrip's 25 clicks east. We have 40 minutes before those planes are in the wind." The tires tore into the sand, the jeep bouncing hard over uneven ground. She kept her eyes on the horizon, every instinct screaming that they were cutting it too close. The flash drive in her pocket felt heavier than it should, proof of a conspiracy, but also a target painted squarely on her back. As they crested a ridge, the faint glow of floodlights came into view. The airstrip was a thin scar of tarmac in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by low hangars and a chain-link perimeter. Even from here, she could see the 2 cargo planes from the feed, their engines already spinning. "No front gate," Ash said. "They'll be expecting trouble from that direction." She spotted a shallow gully running alongside the fence, just deep enough to hide them from the guard towers. "Take us through there. We'll come up behind the hangars." They ditched the jeep in the gully and went the rest of the way on foot, moving low. The sound of the engines grew louder, a steady thunder that seemed to vibrate in her chest. When they reached the rear fence, she clipped a section with bolt cutters and slid through. The smell of aviation fuel was sharp in the air, mingled with the faint tang of oil and hot metal. From the cover of the nearest hangar, She counted at least a dozen armed men patrolling the tarmac. More stood by the cargo ramps of the planes, scanning the perimeter. They weren't sloppy, they moved like professionals. "What's the play?" Ash asked. "We can't take them all head-on," she said, "but we don't have to." Her eyes went to the fuel trucks parked near the planes. If they went up, neither aircraft would be leaving tonight. Ash's grin was thin and humorless. "I like it." They split, Ash moving toward the nearer truck while she crept toward the second. She worked fast, slipping a timed incendiary charge under the chassis. It wasn't elegant, but aviation fuel didn't need much encouragement to become a fireball. A guard's voice cut through the night, sharp, suspicious. She froze, the charge still in her hand, as a flashlight beam swept dangerously close. When the guard turned away, she moved again, attaching the device and sliding back into the shadows. They regrouped near the hangar. 3 minutes, Ash whispered. The first explosion came early. The nearer truck went up in a bloom of orange fire, the blast wave slamming against her chest. Guards shouted, some running toward the flames, others toward the remaining plane. The second truck detonated seconds later, a deafening roar that turned the tarmac into a wall of heat. Shrapnel rained down, pinging off the hangar's steel siding. Both planes' crews were already evacuating, engines spooling down in defeat. They'd done it, grounded the syndicate's cargo. But the victory was short-lived. Over the roar of the fires, she heard something else, a deeper, more rhythmic thump. She looked up just in time to see a third aircraft, smaller and faster, lifting off from a secondary runway she hadn't seen on the satellite feed. Ash swore under his breath. They had a backup. Her jaw tightened. Then we follow. The plane climbed into the night, and she knew this fight was far from over. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.